Aurelius, an upscale restaurant located in New York, where the grandeur of sparkling chandeliers blends with an air of quiet power. The red velvet walls embrace the atmosphere, heavy with the weight of old money and new ambition, making this space a vivid picture of luxury. Every detail, every light seems meticulously arranged to complement the expensive outfits and fake smiles of the guests. People accustomed to viewing others as tools to serve their own needs. Amidst this, a figure moves silently, unnoticed, disturbing no one. Sophronia Hartmann, 26 years old, is the perfect image of tranquility. Her hair neatly tied, her pristine white uniform accentuating a beauty that is never truly acknowledged. She walks silently, like a ghost drifting through the parties, conversations completely invisible in this world of power and glamour. Sophronia had learned to become invisible long ago. But in this world, her silence has become a challenge to those who reign here. At a corner table, two men, Victor Kane and Miles, sit together, their finely tailored suits seemingly made to shine under the chandeliers. They laugh softly, their eyes filled with disdain. Their laughter is gentle but sharp, like broken glass. And then they switch to another language, German, seemingly to protect their mockery from the ears of those around them. "She's just a goldfish," Victor whispers, his eyes filled with contempt. "A pretty face, but as smart as a goldfish." Miles laughs loudly, his rudeness unmasked. Sophronia, without a hint of reaction, continues with her work, pouring wine for them with steady hands, her eyes betraying no emotion. But inside her, a small crack begins to form, a crack that has been suppressed for far too long. She leaves the table, and their laughter lingers in her ears, like shards of glass falling, sharp and unforgettable. She places the glass under the water, trying to clean it, but her hands aren't just cleaning stains off the glassware. Every motion, every gesture is a way to push away memories she doesn't even want to recall. Memories from a past when she had a promising future, now shattered into painful fragments. A sudden light flashes in her mind. The memories of H. Heidelberg, where she had once been an admired scholar, sitting in long lecture halls discussing economic formulas, theories, and creativity. She vividly remembers the afternoons when sunlight filtered through large windows, illuminating scholarly faces. She remembers her teacher's compliments. "Your talent will take you far." And then, like a gust of wind, that phone call came. Her father, Carl Hartmann's voice, the man who had raised her with stories about stars and innovative solutions. His voice broke with fear. His company, Northwind, was in danger. Stocks were plummeting. Investors were pulling out. Competitors were just waiting to strike. That alarm was a thunderclap that struck her life. She couldn't save her father from the collapse. And as a final blow, the betrayal from those he trusted completely destroyed everything. She returned to the U.S., abandoning her dreams. To care for her father, she left behind hopes and aspirations for a brilliant future. And from that moment, another life began. A life of dead ends, where she had to do a job she once considered temporary, where she had to stand in the shadows of glory that had been left behind. And here in Aurelius, she became part of this world, a world that would never truly welcome her. Here she had no name, just a waitress, part of the machine in motion. But inside her, fragments of the past remained, fragments of a girl who once had everything: intelligence, confidence, and faith in justice. Sophronia stood alone in the corner of the Aurelius kitchen, hurriedly cleaning the shiny wine glasses. Under the warm yellow lights, each glass seemed like a crystal vase, holding all the falseness of the world around her. The world she, a girl once filled with hope for the future, now had to hide in the shadows of service. The droplets of water on the glass no longer represented just the stains of hard work. Each drop seemed to cleanse the memories, the wounds in her heart. For a long time, she had learned to become a ghost, an entity with no name, no identity. She became a part of this scene, silent, humble, and invisible. No one among the wealthy guests here saw her, only noticing the service. They didn't pay attention to her face, only to the food, the wine, and the perfection of the evening. And she, once a talented scholar, now had to lower herself, hiding in the darkness of being forgotten. But silence was not peace. Sophronia's silence was oppression, a wound that could not heal. In her mind, a storm was quietly rising, waiting for a chance to burst. Each day that passed, the pain grew too large to bear, but she couldn't speak it out. One day she knew silence would no longer be enough, and then all the suffering would be released. That day, an unexpected event occurred in the restaurant. Two wealthy men, Victor Kane and Miles, came to her table. Both were the epitome of extravagance, men who could buy anything and had become used to speaking harsh words without consequences. They sat down, their eyes looking down at her as if she were just a part of the decor, a luxury leather chair, nothing more. She showed no fear, nor did the contempt in their eyes shake her. Instead, she silently served, continuing her work. But the moment she heard her father's name, Carl Hartmann, from Victor's mouth, everything stopped. Victor laughed mockingly, his words like daggers cutting deep into her heart. "Carl Hartmann," he said, "the fool who thinks that ethics will protect him. He truly is an amateur playing with predators." Sophronia felt a sharp pain in her chest, as if the whole world had collapsed. She stood there, unable to believe that the men who had destroyed her father's career could sit before her and mock him like this. She had grown accustomed to patience, to enduring, but this was the first time she felt herself being dragged into a trap, crushed by words that could never be forgiven. Her back slightly arched, her hand gripped the wine bottle tightly, eyes not moving away. Each drop of wine she poured was a sign of the patience she had kept for all these years. But at that moment, everything seemed to go beyond the limit. Her silence was no longer enough to hide the fury rising inside her. She could not continue to be invisible. It was time to face the truth. Victor and Miles continued to mock, while Sophronia stood there, not speaking a word, but inside her, a decision was beginning to form. Their words had not only hurt her, but they had also hurt everything she believed in about family and justice. A new fire began to ignite within her. She was no longer just a waitress in this restaurant. She was Carl Hartmann's daughter, and she would not let them destroy him any further. Under the golden lights, amidst the luxurious tables and the triumphant laughter, Sophronia began to feel a change within herself. She was no longer a ghost. She was a woman, strong and determined, and her fight began right then. Sophronia turned away, leaving behind Victor's mockery and Miles' challenging laughter. She walked out of the service area, down the dark hallway, a place no one paid attention to. But in her mind, everything had changed. Every step she took was no longer an escape, but a preparation for a battle she knew would not be easy. Her heart raced as if wanting to drown everything. Victor's words still echoed in her head. Carl Hartmann, the fool. She couldn't forget how he said her father's name, as if it was something to be ridiculed, unworthy of respect. But the more she thought about his words, the more determined she became to do something. Her father had once been a creative man, someone with ideals. And men like Victor, those who destroyed those ideals with money and greed, should pay for their actions. She couldn't let that continue. She knew that if she did nothing, men like Victor would continue to live in their illusion of power and invulnerability. And she, Carl Hartmann's daughter, would not allow her father's respect to be trampled any further. When she stood in front of the mirror in the changing room, her reflection illuminated by the dim light, she couldn't help but smile. It wasn't a smile of joy, but one of realization. She knew she could no longer hide. She could no longer live in the shadow of pain and loss. Today, silence was no longer her shield. It had become a cracked armor. The pain from the losses, the betrayals, and the disappointment she had endured for so many years no longer smothered her. It had turned into a flame in her heart, burning and urging her to act. Sophronia was no longer the girl she used to be, hiding in the shadows. She was now a woman ready to confront all that had held her back, and she wasn't afraid of stepping out into the light. As she returned to the service area, Sophronia was no longer the smiling, obedient girl she used to be. Her steps were more confident, her eyes now filled with a determination no one could easily recognize. When she brought a bottle of wine to Victor's table, she no longer feared his gaze. She was no longer the figure standing on the sidelines of their lives. Victor and Miles looked at her, but this time, Sophronia didn't lower her gaze. She stood before them with a confidence she had never shown before. Everything, from the lighting in the room to the atmosphere around them, seemed to be reshaped, not by their glamour and power, but by the resilience she carried within her. As she placed the bottle of wine in front of Victor, she looked him straight in the eyes with cold composure, no sign of fear or hesitation. And when she heard his sarcastic remark about how this wine is worth more than your life, an unusual sense of calm washed over her. Instead of reacting with anger or sorrow, Sophronia simply smiled, gently but powerfully. She lowered her head, beginning to pour the wine into the glass, each drop falling slowly, as if each drop represented a part of her rebirth. From that moment, everything had changed. She was no longer a victim of them. She was Carl Hartmann's daughter, and she had found her strength. Everything around Sophronia seemed to slow down at this moment. Although she maintained her calm demeanor, deep inside, a storm was quietly rising. Victor Kane's words still rang in her ears. Every sentence he uttered was not just an insult, but an affront to her father, the man she admired and loved, the man who had dedicated his life to science and society. She couldn't forget the image of her father sitting there, his eyes cloudy from illness, his body frail, but still steadfast. Time had worn him down, but he never abandoned his ideals. Yet men like Victor, those who trample those ideals with money and greed, still managed to survive and continue to flaunt their arrogance. Sophronia couldn't let that continue. She knew that if she did nothing, men like Victor would continue to live in their illusion of power. And she, Carl Hartmann's daughter, would not allow her father's legacy to be destroyed any further. As she stood in front of the mirror in the changing room, her reflection illuminated by dim lighting, she couldn't help but smile. It wasn't a smile of joy, but one of realization. She knew she could no longer hide. She could no longer live in the shadow of pain and loss. Today, silence was no longer her shield. It had become a cracked armor. The pain of loss, betrayal, and disappointment she had suffered over the years no longer smothered her. It had transformed into a flame in her heart, burning fiercely and urging her to take action. Sophronia was no longer the girl she used to be, hiding in the shadows. She was now a woman ready to confront everything that had held her back, and she wasn't afraid to step into the light. When she returned to the service area, Sophronia was no longer the smiling, obedient girl she once was. Her steps were more confident, and her eyes now radiated determination that no one could easily ignore. When she brought the wine bottle to Victor's table, she no longer feared his gaze. She was no longer just a bystander in their world. Victor and Miles looked at her, but this time Sophronia didn't lower her gaze. She stood before them with a confidence she had never shown before. Everything around them, from the lighting in the room to the atmosphere, seemed to shift, not by their opulence and power, but by the resilience she carried within her. As she placed the wine bottle before Victor, she looked him in the eyes with cold composure, no trace of fear or hesitation. And when she heard his sarcastic comment about this wine being worth more than your life, a strange sense of calm washed over her. Instead of reacting with anger or sadness, Sophronia simply smiled, gently but powerfully. She lowered her head, beginning to pour the wine into the glass, each drop falling slowly, as if every drop represented a part of her rebirth. From that moment on, everything had changed. She was no longer a victim. She was Carl Hartmann's daughter, and she had found her strength. The atmosphere in the room now felt thick, tense to the point of suffocating. Every eye was on Sophronia and Jackson, who had just walked up to stand beside her. Everyone in the room seemed to be caught in a whirlpool they couldn't escape from, between the choice of standing with power or standing with righteousness. Victor was still sitting there, his face red, looking like a beast cornered. But in his eyes there was still a flicker of arrogance, a sliver of hope that he could still impose his power. Sophronia felt it clearly, but she wasn't afraid. She had spent too many years living in the shadows of endurance, and now she was ready to face the blinding light of truth. Every word Victor said wasn't just an insult. It was a blow to her heart, to everything she believed about family and justice. Her father had been a creative man, a man with ideals, and men like Victor, those who destroyed those ideals with money and greed, needed to pay for their actions. She couldn't let that continue. She knew that if she stayed silent, men like Victor would continue to live in their delusion of power and invulnerability. And she, Carl Hartmann's daughter, would not allow her father's legacy to be trampled further. As she stood there still, in the silence of the room, Sophronia felt an overwhelming sense of calm. The tension in her body eased. The years of suffering and loss no longer had the power to suppress her. Everything had led her to this point. She wasn't weak anymore. She was a daughter, and she would defend her father's legacy, not with words, but with actions. Her steps were strong, and she walked toward Victor's table, where he sat, satisfied with his cruelty. The guests around them were still quiet, sneaking glances, as if waiting for something to happen but not daring to speak up. Sophronia stopped in front of them without saying a word. Instead, she pulled from her pocket a thin sheet of paper, printed with her father's name, Carl Hartmann, and his research. It was the work her father had kept for years, his studies on water filtration technology, the inventions he had nurtured, hoping one day they would be recognized. She placed the paper on the table before Victor, her eyes never leaving his. Victor scowled at it and then smirked. "What is this?" he asked, his voice dripping with contempt. Sophronia didn't rush to answer. She let the silence fill the space, allowing the weight of the moment to sink in. After a brief pause, she spoke, her voice steady but cold. "This is my father's work, and if you continue to speak about him like that, I will make sure everyone who follows you will have to reconsider their actions." Victor paused, his face shifting from smugness to discomfort. He opened his mouth to retort, but the sound of a ringing clock interrupted him, a distraction no one had expected. All eyes in the room turned toward Sophronia. She stood there unmoving, but she knew that everything she had said had already begun to take root in the minds of those around her. From afar, Jackson, the manager of Aurelius, walked over, his gaze moving from Sophronia to Victor. The silence grew thicker as he approached the table, and for the first time there was no respect in his eyes, no admiration for Victor. Jackson stood still, not saying anything, but everyone could feel the shift in the air. Sophronia knew that he wasn't someone easily swayed, and now they were standing together in a battle that was impossible to avoid. Victor looked around, searching for support from the others in the room, but this time, no one spoke up. The silence of the onlookers felt like a declaration. The power Victor once thought was unshakable was beginning to crumble, and Sophronia, along with Jackson, was the one to push it to its breaking point. Sophronia didn't know how it would all end, but one thing was certain. This confrontation, no matter how difficult, would be the start of change. The atmosphere in Aurelius slowly began to settle, but the change within the space lingered. After Victor and Miles left, the oppressive shadow of power and arrogance that had weighed down on everything faded away. Under the glow of the chandelier lights, the fine tables, once the stage for power plays, now witnessed Sophronia's transformation. She didn't rush to leave the room, nor did she seek the spotlight or any praise. She stood there, in the quiet space between empty tables, where only moments ago there had been the silence of fear and submission. Every gaze from the staff and patrons was now focused on her, no longer filled with disdain or contempt. But Sophronia knew that these changes were only temporary. True transformation didn't happen in an instant. It was a journey. Having emerged from the shadows of silence and sacrifice, Sophronia now felt that her heart was no longer shackled by the past. The determination in her eyes was no longer just for revenge or proving a point. It was a declaration of a new beginning. She had the strength to face everything that had held her back, and now she wasn't afraid to stand up for herself. Jackson approached her, his eyes sharp but filled with understanding. They both stood in silence for a moment, as if feeling the weight of what had just transpired. Finally, he spoke, his voice calm but unwavering. "You did the right thing, Sophronia. But you also know that today's victory is just a small part of the long journey ahead." Sophronia smiled, her eyes lighting up with a renewed sense of purpose. "Exactly, Jackson. I know everything won't be easy from here, but at least now I've found myself again, and I won't go back to the shadows." Jackson nodded, his gaze not leaving Sophronia's face. He understood that she wasn't just fighting for herself, but for something much greater, the values that had been abandoned and the people who had been overlooked. "You're going to need someone like you to change this place, to make it not just a fine dining establishment, but a place that truly respects the people who work here," Jackson said, his tone filled with respect. Sophronia took a deep breath, feeling the quiet around her. She didn't need to say anything more. She knew this was the path she had to walk, not just for herself, but to help others like her. Those who had lived in darkness, who had been forgotten and underestimated. She would rebuild from the ground up, with passion and a burning desire to create a fair environment where no one had to silently endure anymore. Looking at Jackson, Sophronia knew they would accomplish this together. It wouldn't be an easy victory, but it would be a slow, steadfast revolution, changing things from within. They stood in silence for a moment longer before Sophronia turned to look at the tables, the patrons, and everything that had happened. She understood now that true change wasn't just about determination. It was about patience, courage, and holding on to an ideal that never fades. Today, she hadn't just defeated Victor Kane. She had conquered the silence that had tormented her for so long. And from this day on, she would begin again. On a crisp autumn morning, when the light quietly filtered through the trees in the park near Aurelius, Sophronia stood by the window of her apartment, gazing out at the city waking up. A thin mist hung on the tall buildings, reflecting the warm golden sunlight, as if the day itself was greeting her. From this vantage point, everything she had gone through over the years seemed like a distant, hazy dream. But today, as she looked at the busy streets and the people hurrying along, she felt with clarity that this dream was beginning to change. She had found herself, and now she stood at a new crossroads in her life. A path with no Victor Kane, no more contemptuous glances, and no more painful silence. Sophronia had done what she once thought was impossible. And now, standing here, she was no longer the girl buried in her past. She had become a strong woman, confident, with a new mission, not only to live for herself, but to make the world a better place. Throughout the past months, Sophronia had begun to notice changes in herself. She was no longer the quiet sufferer. She had become a warrior, unafraid to confront injustice. Jackson's words about justice and respect for human dignity still echoed in her mind. He had seen the potential in her, and that had ignited a fire within her. A fire not just to restore her self-respect, but to change an entire system. Now she was a manager at Aurelius with a great task ahead. Jackson had placed his trust in her, not just because she stood up to Victor, but because she understood the value of fairness and respect. Sophronia had been given the power to reform, not just for herself, but for all the workers. Those who had once, like her, been overlooked and dismissed. She was no longer working as a puppet in that glamorous world. She was the one leading, the one creating change. But the road ahead wasn't going to be easy. Sophronia would face those who still refused to accept change, those who clung to old habits. They wouldn't easily let go of their fake veneer of power and arrogance that had been built over the years. Every day, Sophronia would have to prove that courage wasn't just a fleeting display, but a long journey of persistence and transformation from within. On mornings like this, when she stood alone in her apartment, watching the city, Sophronia no longer felt lonely. The struggles she had gone through before, when she had quietly walked in the shadows, now seemed like a part of a distant past. She now had the strength to move forward, to build a future, not just for herself, but for those who had fought for justice and respect. And deep down, Sophronia knew that the road ahead was long, but nothing would stop her now. She would continue to fight, not only for what was lost, but for what could be achieved in the future. She was no longer the ghost in Aurelius. She was Sophronia Hartmann, and she had found herself. As the sunlight streamed into her room, Sophronia felt a strange sense of peace. New dreams not just for herself, but for a fairer world, a world where everyone was respected and valued, had begun to take shape. And now she would be the one to lead those dreams into reality. Each morning, Sophronia woke up with a sense of difference, not worry or fear, but a readiness for the new challenges ahead. Each passing day, the stories of justice and respect for human dignity she had fiercely pursued began to take shape and spread. However, Sophronia knew that the path she had chosen wasn't an easy one. The outside world was still burdened with entrenched bastions of power and falsehoods. Today, like any other day, Sophronia had an important meeting with Jackson. She knew he had been tracking the changes in the company every day, encouraging her to look beyond just restoring Aurelius, but to change the very culture of the industry. Nevertheless, there was still much to be done, and Sophronia understood that she couldn't do it all alone. Contrary to her strong exterior and unwavering resolve, Sophronia still carried doubts in her heart, unspoken questions about the next steps. Although she had made significant changes in the company, the resistance from the old guard within the management was still present. They waited for any weakness, a chance to return to their old ways. Late in the morning, as Sophronia prepared to step into the meeting room with Jackson, she received a message she couldn't ignore. It was a warning. One of her longtime colleagues, someone she had trusted, had just been implicated in a financial scandal within the company. This was a major shock to Sophronia. She couldn't believe that someone she had seen as a reliable partner was involved in such a scheme. Her heart grew heavy. Everything she had worked to build, the changes she had fought for, could come crashing down because of one person. Sophronia knew this was the biggest challenge of her career, not only because of the pressure from the company, but also because of the cost of betrayal, the exploitation of the trust she had placed in people. As she walked into the meeting room, Jackson's eyes met hers with understanding. He didn't need to ask. He could see the shift in Sophronia. She wasn't the quiet woman under the golden lights of Aurelius anymore. She had become a true leader, but now the real test was coming. Jackson said nothing, simply handing her a thick file, the investigation report on her colleague. Sophronia took the file, her hands shaking, but she knew she couldn't avoid it. Jackson watched her with steady eyes. "This is your moment, Sophronia. The decisions you make today will shape not just your future, but the future of this company. Are you ready to face this challenge?" Jackson's words echoed in Sophronia's mind. She knew that if she didn't act right now, the company would spiral into crisis, and all her efforts to bring about change would be for nothing. She took a deep breath, opened the file, and began to analyze every detail. In her mind, a plan began to form. She would not only handle this fairly, but she would also expose the schemes her colleague had orchestrated. Furthermore, she knew she had to speak up, stand up for the values she had fought for her whole life. Step by step, Sophronia decided that she wouldn't just defend the company. She would make Aurelius a place where every worker could take pride, where integrity and respect were paramount. This betrayal, painful as it was, would serve as the catalyst to restore justice within the company. As she left the meeting room, Sophronia felt a strange sensation wash over her. No more fear, no more doubt. Every decision she made from now on would be unwavering. She was ready for the biggest fight of her life. Sophronia couldn't forget the feeling of holding the investigative documents about her former colleague, the one she had once trusted. She felt the cold sting of betrayal spreading through her body. Everything she had worked to build, from her time at Aurelius to the changes she had fought for from within, was now threatened by a hidden snake. She was ready to face this challenge, but there was an undeniable rise of anxiety with every passing moment. The price of honesty was sometimes too high, especially when it meant confronting power, those who could use money to cover up everything. Sophronia knew this battle was not just against one person, but a struggle between good and evil, between the values she held dear and the ruthless forces that would do anything to maintain their control. When she walked into the meeting room again, where important decisions were about to be made, the light in the room seemed to dim. The anxiety still held her, but Sophronia knew she couldn't turn back. She understood that every decision today would be a turning point, not just for Aurelius, but for herself. This betrayal could not go unpunished. As the light in the meeting room returned, Jackson looked at her with understanding in his eyes. He knew Sophronia was ready. He said nothing, simply handing her a thick file, the investigation report on her colleague. Sophronia took the file, her hands trembling, but she knew she could not avoid this. Jackson gazed at her with steady resolve. "This is your moment, Sophronia. The decisions you make today will define the future, not just of you, but of this company. Are you ready to face this challenge?" His words rang in Sophronia's ears. She understood that if she didn't act now, the company would fall into crisis, and her efforts to transform it would be wasted. She took a deep breath, opened the file, and began going through every detail. In her mind, a plan began to take shape. She wouldn't just address this situation fairly, she would expose the manipulations and deceit her colleague had been involved in. Moreover, she knew she had to speak up, stand firm for the values she had fought for all her life. Step by step, Sophronia decided she wouldn't just protect the company. She would make Aurelius a place where every employee could take pride, where honesty and respect would reign supreme. This betrayal, painful as it was, would serve as the catalyst to restore justice within the company. As she walked out of the meeting room, Sophronia felt an unusual sense of clarity. There was no fear left, no more doubt. Every decision she would make from here on out would be resolute. She was prepared for the greatest fight of her life. Sophronia stood firm, no sign of worry on her face. In the tense atmosphere of the meeting room, the chandelier lights illuminated every detail of the long table, where the powerful men who had been controlling the company's fate were now listening closely to every word she said. She knew she was standing at a pivotal crossroads, where every choice she made would have far-reaching consequences, not just for herself, but for everyone around her. Her voice, now steady and confident, no longer wavered under the pressure. Victor Kane and what he has done cannot continue. We cannot allow a man like him to keep controlling everything in this company. We will fight, and I won't stop until the truth is exposed. The eyes of the directors in the room flickered between fear and anticipation. Some of them clenched their jaws, wary of the price they might have to pay if they sided with Sophronia. But others, the quieter ones with true power, looked at her with silent understanding. They knew this was no longer a personal matter. This was a battle for dignity, for principles. "You're talking about a big fight here, Sophronia," one of the influential directors said, his voice dry as if each word was carefully weighed. "Victor is too powerful. If we go against him, we'll lose everything. Don't think it will be as simple as that." Sophronia did not flinch. She stood tall, no sign of fatigue or hesitation. "If you cannot face the truth, if you choose to continue ignoring what's happening, then maybe this company doesn't deserve my fight anymore." She looked each of them in the eye, as if demanding them to feel the conviction in her words. "Integrity, honesty, and respect are the values I am willing to protect, no matter the cost. If Aurelius cannot uphold those values, I will not stay." The room fell silent. Sophronia's words hit deep. They knew she was right. This wasn't just about defending her father, her company, or even herself. This was about doing what was right, about standing up for what they had lost sight of. Taking a deep breath, Sophronia picked up the prepared documents. She knew she couldn't just speak. She had to present the evidence. These documents would expose the lies, the false reports, the manipulation Victor had orchestrated. "I have all the proof, the fraudulent transactions, the fake reports, and the manipulation that Victor has carried out. This ends now." She placed the documents on the table, watching the reactions of the room. Some faces went stiff, while others seemed to soften, their eyes showing agreement. Sophronia knew these documents would be the breakthrough to finally end this. Jackson, who had remained silent by her side, stepped forward. His gaze was filled with admiration as he nodded, recognizing her strength. He didn't speak, but his quiet acknowledgement meant everything. "We will face resistance," Sophronia continued, her voice resolute. "But I believe this is the only way to save this company from ruin." The room was heavy with tension. The directors, who had once feared Victor, now exchanged glances with one another. Sophronia knew this was no longer just about a fight against Victor Kane. It was a battle for integrity and justice. It was a fight for what they had almost lost. One of the directors, who had been silent until then, finally spoke. "Sophronia, I agree with you. It's time we stand up. If we continue siding with Victor, we are no different from those who allow corruption to thrive." The atmosphere in the room began to shift. More whispers followed, others spoke up, and the energy in the room began to change. Sophronia, sensing the shift, allowed herself a small smile. She knew this wasn't the end. The battle had just begun, but she had already achieved something powerful. Jackson looked at her again, his respect for her evident in his eyes. "Thank you for leading them," he said, his voice low but filled with approval. "I never thought I'd see the day when this would happen, but you made it happen." Sophronia turned to look at him, no fear or doubt in her eyes. "We've come too far to turn back," she replied, "and I'm not stepping back." The meeting ended, but this time, the atmosphere was different. For the first time in many years, the people in the room felt the weight of the decisions they had to make. They knew that from this point forward, things would be different. Each moment seemed to stretch out indefinitely. The meeting room was still, heavy with tension. Every eye in the room was focused on Sophronia, the small but resolute woman standing before the powerful men who had once been treated like gods by the company. But now in this moment, they were no longer in control. Sophronia had issued her challenge. The room remained silent, no one daring to speak. It was hard to decide. They all knew this wasn't just a battle for power and money. This was a fight for human dignity, for righteousness. But many of them also felt the looming threat behind this decision. Sophronia wasn't just facing Victor. She was confronting a system that had been in place for too long. A system that had rooted itself in every fiber of Aurelius, feeding off power, money, and fear. One director stood up, staring at Sophronia. "You don't understand the situation," he said, his voice dry, as if every word was tinged with hesitation. "Victor isn't just one person. He's a part of this system. If we go against him, we'll lose everything. Don't think it's going to be as simple as that." Sophronia didn't flinch. She stood tall, unwavering, no sign of weariness or doubt. If you can't face the truth, if you choose to continue ignoring what's happening, then maybe this company doesn't deserve my fight anymore. She met the eyes of each person in the room, as if commanding them to feel the force behind her words. Respect, integrity, and honesty are the values I am willing to protect, no matter the cost. If Aurelius cannot uphold those values, I will not stay. The room was silent. Sophronia's words pierced deeply. They all knew she was right. This wasn't just about defending her father, her company, or even herself. This was about doing what was right, about standing up for what they had forgotten. She took a deep breath and reached for the prepared documents. She knew that she couldn't just talk. She had to present the evidence. These files would expose the fraud, the false reports, and the manipulation that Victor had carried out. "I have all the proof, the fraudulent transactions, the fabricated reports, and the manipulations Victor has orchestrated. This ends now." She placed the documents on the table, watching the reactions of everyone in the room. Some faces went stiff, but others softened, their eyes reflecting agreement. Sophronia knew that these documents would be the breakthrough they needed to bring it all to light. Jackson, who had been standing silently beside her, stepped forward. His gaze was filled with admiration. He didn't speak, but his quiet recognition meant everything. "We will face strong opposition," Sophronia continued, her voice now even firmer. "But I believe this is the only way to save this company from destruction." The room was still. The directors, who had once cowered in fear of Victor, exchanged glances. Sophronia knew that this wasn't just about a fight against Victor Kane. This was a fight for integrity, for what they had almost lost. One of the directors, who had been silent up until now, finally spoke. "Sophronia, I agree with you. It's time for us to stand up. If we continue to side with Victor, we will be no different than those who allow corruption to thrive." The atmosphere in the room shifted. Whispers began, more voices joined in, and the energy slowly began to change. Sophronia, sensing the change, allowed herself a small smile. She knew this wasn't the end. The real battle had just begun, but she had already won something powerful. Jackson looked at her again, his respect for her evident in his eyes. "Thank you for leading them," he said, his voice low but filled with approval. "I never thought I'd see the day this would happen, but you made it happen." Sophronia turned to look at him, no fear or doubt in her eyes. "We've come too far to turn back," she replied, "and I'm not stepping back." The meeting ended, but this time the air was different. For the first time in many years, the people in the room felt the weight of the decisions they had to make. They knew that from this moment on, everything would change. The next day, the atmosphere at Aurelius was different. The change had begun to infiltrate every corner of the once opulent restaurant. Under the sparkling chandelier lights, the expensive suits, and the fine wines still being served, the looks from the guests had changed. There was suspicion, even respect in their eyes whenever they looked at Sophronia. She was no longer the silent servant, nameless and unseen. She had become a symbol of defiance, of standing up for one's beliefs. As Sophronia walked into Aurelius that morning, no one turned their back on her anymore. No one avoided her gaze. She was now leading a change no one had expected. But perhaps the most remarkable thing wasn't the change in the people around her, but the transformation within herself. She was no longer the girl in the restaurant uniform, nor the daughter buried under the pain of loss. Sophronia Hartmann had become the one in charge, the one making a difference. She entered the meeting room with a newfound confidence. No longer the woman who had once worked in the shadows, but one who had built her confidence from a deep belief in herself and in justice. Every step she took echoed through the room. As she entered the boardroom, the eyes of the directors, the people who had once kept their distance, now looked at her differently. No longer disdainful or self-righteous, there was a quiet respect in their eyes. They had begun to realize that this fight wasn't just about power, it was about politics, morality, and integrity. "We've made our decision," Richard, the director in charge of finance, said calmly but firmly. "We can no longer stand by Victor Kane. Continuing our collaboration with him has caused too much damage. We all know we've been complicit in his wrongdoings, but today we will do what's right." Sophronia smiled softly, not out of pride, but because the respect from those around her had shifted. She turned to Jackson, who had stood in the room from the start, his arms crossed, his gaze sharp, watching every moment unfold. "Yes," Sophronia said, her voice now full of conviction. "But this is just the beginning. There's still so much work to do. Not only to remove the wrongdoers, but to rebuild this entire system from the ground up." Jackson nodded in agreement, his gaze never leaving hers. "That's right," he said. "We're starting over. And this time, we won't ever step back." Sophronia turned back to the board of directors, her eyes firm with determination. "If we want Aurelius to become a place where people can truly respect and trust, we have to start from scratch. We must ensure transparency and fairness for all employees, and most importantly, no one should ever again be able to manipulate or abuse their power." One director, who had previously sided with Victor, spoke up. "Sophronia, I'm with you. It's time we take a stand. If we continue to side with Victor, we're no different from those who let corruption thrive. Today, I choose to stand with integrity." The room was filled with murmurs of agreement. The atmosphere had changed. There was no more fear, no more uncertainty. Only the collective will to right the wrongs that had been allowed to persist for so long. Sophronia, sensing the shift, allowed herself a small smile. She knew this was only the beginning, but the battle was already won. Jackson stepped closer to her, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. He said nothing, but his eyes were filled with respect and admiration. "Thank you for leading them," he said softly. "I didn't think I'd ever see the day this would happen, but you made it happen." Sophronia turned to face him, no trace of fear or doubt in her eyes. "We've come too far to turn back," she replied, "and I'm not stepping back." The meeting ended, but this time the atmosphere was different. For the first time in many years, the people in the room felt the weight of their decisions. They knew that, from now on, nothing would be the same. Thank you for following this story with us. If you found this video inspiring or it helped you see life in a new light, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your feedback. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, be sure to hit subscribe so you don't miss any exciting and meaningful videos in the future. Thank you again, and we'll see you in the next videos. Wishing you strength and confidence on your journey.